World War II began with a terrifying and deceptive speed. It was a conflict born from the unresolved traumas of the First World War, yet it moved with a velocity that seemed to belong to a new, more ruthless century. When Nazi Germany's forces crossed into Poland in September 1939, they did more than just violate a border. They tore open the fragile fabric of a world that had spent 2 decades desperately hoping to avoid another global catastrophe. The ensuing moments were a blur of motion and conquest, a storm of steel and fire that appeared to confirm the dark promises of a new order built on strength, obedience, and total victory. At the very beginning, Adolf Hitler's war machine presented an image of terrifying invincibility. It was an engine of conquest that seemed to operate beyond the known rules of engagement, rendering established military doctrines obsolete overnight. Poland fell with shocking swiftness, its defenses overwhelmed. Then, the great power of France, a cornerstone of European security, collapsed in a matter of weeks, a development that sent tremors of fear across the entire continent. Europe, a land of ancient nations and proud armies, seemed to tremble and buckle before the relentless advance. Britain, isolated and vulnerable, stood as one of the last bastions against a tide that threatened to engulf everything. But within the DNA of every swift victory, a seed of future ruin was already planted. The very speed that defined Germany's early success became a potent poison, intoxicating the regime's leadership with a dangerous sense of infallibility. With each conquered nation and redrawn map, Hitler grew more convinced that he was not merely a political leader, but an instrument of destiny, a figure to whom the laws of history no longer applied. His belief in his own genius swelled, blinding him to the immense risks he was taking and the powerful forces he was antagonizing. The war machine, designed for conquest, developed an insatiable appetite. This is the story of how that machine, seemingly unstoppable in its ascent, ultimately engineered its own spectacular downfall. It is a narrative of overreach, of a system built on a foundation of lies that eventually could no longer distinguish propaganda from reality. The more the German army conquered, the more Hitler believed he could not fail. The more Europe fell under his dominion, the more he believed history itself was bending to his will. And the more powerful the machine became, the more it demanded another target, another gamble, until it finally turned its destructive power inward, consuming the very nation it swore to elevate. The initial victories were not just military triumphs, they were carefully orchestrated acts of propaganda designed to create an aura of destiny. The fall of Poland, followed by the stunningly rapid collapse of Western Europe, was presented to the German people and the world as undeniable proof of the Nazi system's superiority. It was framed as the dawn of a new era, where the perceived weaknesses of democracy were being swept away by the focused will of a unified, powerful state. The newsreels, the radio broadcasts, and the triumphant rallies all reinforced a single intoxicating message. Germany was rising, its enemies were decadent and weak, and its leader was an infallible visionary. This narrative of invincibility was a powerful tool, but it was also a gilded cage. It trapped the Nazi leadership, and Hitler in particular, within a fortress of their own making. Every successful campaign made it harder to counsel caution, and every fallen capital made it impossible to suggest restraint. The regime became addicted to the very momentum it had created. To stop, to negotiate, or to consolidate would have been perceived not as a strategic choice, but as a sign of weakness, a betrayal of the grand destiny that propaganda had promised the German people. The war machine was no longer just a tool of foreign policy. It had become the central justification for the regime's existence. This created a dangerous feedback loop where military success fueled ideological extremism, and ideological extremism demanded further military gambles. The system was built on the idea of perpetual struggle and expansion. It required constant motion to sustain its internal logic. The war was not just about acquiring territory, it was about proving the core tenets of Nazi ideology, the supremacy of the Aryan race, the necessity of acquiring so-called living space, and the inherent right to dominate others. This ideological fervor pushed the war machine to take risks that defied sound military and economic reasoning, creating a structure that was brilliant in the short term but inherently unstable. The illusion of a swift, contained war was perhaps the most dangerous fantasy of all. Hitler envisioned a series of short, decisive campaigns, each one securing resources for the next, allowing Germany to defeat its enemies one by one before they could unite. He failed to understand that the very nature of his aggression would inevitably forge the powerful coalition that he sought to avoid. The initial speed of the Blitzkrieg created a false sense of control, masking the reality that Germany was a nation with finite resources embarking on a mission of potentially infinite conquest. The machine ran on the fuel of early victories, but its tank was not bottomless. The turning point was not a single event, but a slow, grinding process of reversal. It began subtly in the skies over Britain, where the Royal Air Force refused to break, handing the Luftwaffe its first significant setback. This resistance shattered the pattern of effortless victory and proved that will and resilience could stand against mechanical shock. Britain's survival was more than a military stalemate. It was a profound psychological blow to the myth of Nazi invincibility. It provided a sanctuary for resistance, a base of operations, and a symbol of hope that the tide could and would eventually turn against the aggressors who had dominated the continent. The fatal overreach came with the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the ultimate expression of Hitler's ideological ambition, a crusade for land and racial purification. But the vastness of the East, the brutal winters, and the sheer tenacity of the Soviet people swallowed the German war machine whole. The further the armies advanced, the more stretched their supply lines became, and the more the campaign devolved from a lightning war into a grueling war of attrition. This was a conflict Germany was structurally unprepared to win. The Eastern Front became a colossal graveyard for men and material, bleeding the machine of its strength, momentum, and morale. Simultaneously, Germany's own actions ensured that it would face a global coalition with near-limitless industrial and demographic power. The declaration of war on the United States following the attack on Pearl Harbor was a catastrophic strategic blunder. It pitted the German economy against the industrial might of America, a nation that could outproduce Germany in tanks, ships, and aircraft on a scale that was simply unimaginable. The conflict transformed from a European war into a global war of production, a battle of factories and resources where Germany's early advantages in speed and training were rendered increasingly irrelevant against the sheer weight of its combined enemies. Ultimately, the war machine that had set out to conquer Europe was crushed by the world it had awakened. The system built on the premise of its own superiority could not adapt to the reality of its own limitations. As the Allies closed in from the west, east, and south, the regime's response was not to seek peace or preserve what was left of the nation, but to demand more sacrifice, to double down on failed strategies, and to blame betrayal for defeats caused by its own hubris. The war machine did not just lose. It collapsed inward, pulling the entire country down with it into a maelstrom of destruction, leaving behind a legacy of ruin and a stark warning for all time. On September 1st, 1939, at the break of dawn, the fragile peace of Europe was shattered. German forces stormed across the Polish border, unleashing a new form of warfare that the world was utterly unprepared to face. This was not a mere border skirmish or another diplomatic crisis to be negotiated away in a smoke-filled room. This was the moment the long, winding road to war, paved with years of appeasement and broken promises, finally reached its violent destination. For years, Adolf Hitler had systematically tested the world's resolve, chipping away at the post-World War I order with each audacious move. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the seizure of the Sudetenland, and the eventual dismemberment of Czechoslovakia had all been met with hesitation and compromise. But the invasion of Poland was different. It was a line crossed in full view of a world that had run out of excuses for inaction. Britain and France, having finally understood the futility of appeasement, had issued firm guarantees to protect Polish sovereignty. The diplomatic ultimatums had been delivered, and the final warnings had been ignored. The next step was no longer a matter of negotiation. It was a matter of conflict. German forces, attacking from the west, north, and south, employed a terrifying combination of air power, mechanized armor, and infantry moving at unprecedented speed. Their objective was not simply to occupy territory, but to induce a state of national paralysis, to shatter Poland's ability to mobilize and resist before a coherent defense could even be formed. The strategic nightmare for Poland was then compounded. On September 17th, as Polish forces fought desperately against the German onslaught, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. This cynical act, secretly agreed upon in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sealed Poland's fate. The nation was now trapped in a vice, squeezed between two totalitarian giants intent on carving it up. The Polish army, though brave, was caught between two fronts, facing two enemies with no hope of reinforcement or relief. The campaign was a brutal showcase of modern military mechanics, a grim preview of the destruction that would soon spread across the continent, leaving cities in ruin and landscapes scarred by battle. Just 2 days after the initial German invasion, on September 3, 1939, the governments of Britain and France fulfilled their promise and declared war on Germany. With those solemn declarations, the continent officially plunged into World War II. Yet, even as the news spread across the globe, few could truly grasp the scale of the cataclysm that had just been unleashed. They could not have known that this conflict would grow to engulf the entire planet, that entire cities would be incinerated from the sky, or that industrial-scale mass murder would become a central policy of the aggressor. They only knew that the ghost of the Great War had returned, and Europe was once again at war with itself. Following the swift and brutal conquest of Poland, a strange and unsettling quiet descended upon Western Europe. This period, from late 1939 into the spring of 1940, became known as the Phony War, or the Blitzkrieg, the Sitting War. On the surface, Britain and France were officially at war with Germany, yet there were no major land battles, no great offensives, and no dramatic clashes of armies along the Franco-German border. Soldiers waited behind their respective fortifications, particularly the formidable Maginot Line in France, in an atmosphere of tense inactivity. For many civilians, it felt like a state of suspended animation, a war that had been declared but had not truly begun. This eerie calm fostered a dangerous and misplaced hope that a full-scale conflict might still be avoided. This period of quiet was, however, deeply deceptive. It was not a sign of peace or hesitation, but a moment of intense preparation and strategic calculation. While the Allies remained largely static, lulled into a false sense of security by their defensive doctrines, the German war machine was not idle. It was regrouping, re-evaluating, and refining its plans for the next phase of its European conquest. The lessons learned from the Polish campaign were being analyzed and integrated. The Nazi leadership was using this time to position its forces, stockpile resources, and finalize the audacious strategy that would soon be unleashed upon an unsuspecting Western Europe. The silence was not an absence of war, it was the deep breath before the plunge into total chaos. The Phony War exposed a fundamental flaw in Allied thinking, which was still heavily influenced by the memories of World War I. Allied commanders anticipated a long, grinding war of attrition, where defensive strength and fortifications would be paramount. They expected the conflict to unfold slowly, allowing their superior economic resources and global empires to gradually wear Germany down. They failed to appreciate that Hitler's strategy was built on the exact opposite principle: speed, surprise, and the avoidance of a prolonged struggle. The Allies were preparing for the last war, while Germany was perfecting the tactics of the next one, turning the period of calm into a strategic advantage that would soon prove decisive. This deceptive quiet also had a profound psychological effect, dulling the sense of urgency that should have pervaded the Allied nations. It allowed complacency to set in and delayed the full-scale mobilization of their economies and societies for the total war that was coming. While Germany operated on a full war footing, its factories churning out tanks and planes, the Allies were still transitioning. This temporal gap was a critical vulnerability. The Phony War was a lullaby that coaxed the West into a state of slumber, just as the predator was gathering its strength for a devastating strike. The storm was coming, and the silence only made its eventual arrival more shocking and more catastrophic. The German strategy that would shatter the phony war and stun the world became famously known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. It was not a single, formally written doctrine, but a revolutionary operational concept that combined existing technologies and tactics into a terrifyingly effective new whole. The core idea was to concentrate overwhelming force at a single weak point, rupture the enemy's front line, and then plunge deep into their rear areas with unprecedented speed. This approach was designed not merely to defeat an enemy army, but to paralyze its central nervous system. It was a method built on a lethal synergy of speed, coordination, surprise, and overwhelming psychological shock, a weaponization of tempo itself. The key components of Blitzkrieg were the Panzer divisions, concentrated formations of tanks, supported by mobile infantry and artillery, all operating in close coordination with the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force. Stuka dive bombers acted as flying artillery, terrorizing defenders and clearing a path for the ground forces. The tanks were not used to support infantry, as many other armies did. They were the spearhead, tasked with breaking through and driving relentlessly forward. Their goal was to bypass strong points, disrupt communication lines, sow chaos in the enemy's rear, and encircle large formations of troops before they could react, regroup, or retreat in an organized fashion. It was a strategy that aimed to make the enemy's decision-making cycle obsolete. The psychological impact of this approach was just as important as the physical destruction it caused. By moving faster than the enemy could possibly process information and respond, Blitzkrieg created a sense of panic and helplessness. Commanders found their headquarters overrun, their orders irrelevant, and their maps useless as German panzers appeared where they were least expected. The constant threat from the air, the scream of the dive bombers, and the sudden appearance of tanks deep behind the lines shattered the morale of soldiers and commanders alike. Blitzkrieg did not just break armies. It broke their will to fight by making resistance seem futile and chaotic. It turned the battlefield into a vortex of confusion. This method represented a radical departure from the static trench warfare of the previous generation. It was warfare as motion, a fluid and dynamic form of combat that prized initiative, flexibility, and rapid exploitation of opportunities. The success of the Polish campaign had been a powerful demonstration, but its true potential was yet to be revealed. The German war machine had honed a weapon perfectly suited for the open plains of Europe, a tool designed to deliver a knockout blow before the opponent could even get into a fighting stance. The world, still thinking in terms of front lines and attrition, was about to witness this terrifying new strategy, unleashed with devastating force in the heart of the West. As the winter of 1939 faded into the spring of 1940, the tense quiet of the phony war finally broke. The German war machine roared back to life, but not in the direction many had anticipated. In April 1940, Germany launched a swift and audacious invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark, small and flat, fell in a matter of hours. The campaign in Norway was more complex, a combined arms operation involving naval, air and land forces to secure crucial iron ore routes and naval bases. The move stunned the Allies, who had considered Scandinavian neutrality a given. It demonstrated Germany's operational reach and its willingness to strike preemptively to secure strategic resources, expanding the map of the war northward. This northern campaign was merely a prelude to the main event. On May 10, 1940, the true storm broke over Western Europe. German forces launched a massive offensive against France and the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. The world watched, holding its breath, as the Wehrmacht surged forward. Many military analysts and leaders, including those in the Allied High Command, expected a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, with the main German thrust coming through the flat plains of northern Belgium. The Allies moved their best forces, including the British Expeditionary Force, northward to meet this anticipated attack, believing they were advancing into the decisive battle. But this was all part of a masterful and daring deception. The main German attack, the Sicherschnitt or sickle cut, was not coming through northern Belgium at all. Instead, the bulk of Germany's armoured divisions was secretly pushing through the dense, hilly and supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. This was a sector the French considered naturally defended and had left only lightly guarded. By punching through the Ardennes, The German panzers emerged behind the main Allied armies, cutting them off from their supply lines and the rest of France. It was a strategic gamble of breathtaking audacity, a move that completely unhinged the entire Allied defensive plan before the main battle had even been properly joined. The speed and success of this maneuver created a strategic catastrophe for the Allies. Their finest armies, having rushed north into a trap, were now in danger of being encircled and annihilated with their backs to the sea. The war machine that had been designed for just such a breakthrough was now operating at peak efficiency, its panzers racing for the English Channel. The world, which had been waiting for a slow, methodical war, was now witnessing one of the most powerful military alliances in history being dismantled in a matter of days. The war had entered a new, terrifying phase, and the fate of France, and indeed all of Western Europe, now hung by a thread. In May 1940, the deceptive calm of the so-called phony war was shattered by a storm of steel and fire. Nazi Germany unleashed its long-prepared offensive against Western Europe, striking the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg with overwhelming force. Allied commanders, anticipating a repeat of World War I's Schlieffen Plan, rushed their best forces northward into Belgium to meet what they believed was the main German assault. They were moving directly into a brilliantly conceived trap. The attack on the Low Countries, while powerful, was a masterful diversion. The true heart of the German plan, codenamed Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, was far more audacious and aimed at a point the Allies considered almost impassable, the dense, hilly terrain of the Ardennes forest. While the elite of the French and British armies were drawn north, the main weight of Germany's armoured might, 7 panzer divisions, was pushing through the wooded hills of the Ardennes. French military doctrine had dismissed this sector as unsuitable for a major tank offensive, leaving it defended by second-rate divisions. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The German war machine, honed for difficult terrain and rapid movement, navigated the winding roads and thick forests with astonishing speed. When the panzers emerged from the woods near Sedan, they had effectively bypassed the strongest part of the Allied line and were poised to strike deep into the undefended French rear. This was the Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut. The breakthrough at Sedan on May 13th was the pivotal moment of the campaign. Once across the Meuse River, the German armoured columns did not wait to consolidate their position. They did what the Blitzkrieg concept demanded. They advanced. Under commanders like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, the panzer divisions raced westward toward the English Channel, covering dozens of miles a day. They sliced through communication lines, overran supply depots, and sowed chaos and panic far behind the front lines. The Allied High Command was paralyzed, receiving fragmented reports of German tanks appearing in places that seemed impossible. Their entire strategic framework had been rendered obsolete in a matter of hours. This single daring maneuver completely unhinged the Allied defensive strategy. The most modern and mobile armies of France and Britain, which had confidently marched into Belgium to engage the enemy, suddenly found themselves in a terrifying position. The German spearhead was rapidly closing the gap to the coast, threatening to cut them off from the rest of France and encircle them with their backs to the sea. The war was no longer a fight for territory along a stable front. It had become a desperate race against time. The German war machine was not just defeating its opponents, it was dismantling their ability to even function as a coherent fighting force, proving that speed itself could be the most devastating weapon of all. The psychological shock of the German breakthrough was as devastating as the military reality. The French army, long considered the most powerful land force in Europe and the bedrock of Western defense, began to disintegrate under the relentless pressure. Its command structure, rigid and hierarchical, was simply not equipped to handle the speed of Blitzkrieg. Orders were issued based on information that was hours or even days out of date. Commanders in the field found themselves isolated, their communications cut, facing enemy armor that had seemingly appeared from nowhere. The entire system of command and control, the brain of the army, was short-circuiting in real time, leading to confusion, contradictory orders, and ultimately, paralysis. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience was a nightmare of disorientation and fear. Units that expected to fight a methodical defensive battle found themselves attacked from the flank and rear. Refugees fleeing the fighting clogged the roads, mixing with retreating military columns and hampering any attempt at organized movement or counterattack. The constant presence of the Luftwaffe overhead, particularly the terrifying wail of the Stuka dive bombers, shattered morale and amplified the sense of helplessness. The French army was not defeated in a single great battle. It was unraveled, picked apart piece by an enemy that moved too fast to be contained and too unpredictably to be understood. The overconfidence of the Nazi regime, which would later prove its undoing, was at this moment supercharged by the stunning success. Hitler and his generals watched in amazement as their high-risk gamble paid off more spectacularly than they could have ever imagined. For the German soldiers, it felt as if they were part of an unstoppable historical force, their panzers slicing through the heart of a nation that had defeated their fathers a generation earlier. This sense of invincibility fueled their advance, pushing them to take further risks and maintain a tempo that their exhausted opponents simply could not match. The victory seemed to confirm every piece of propaganda about German superiority and the weakness of the Western democracies. Within 10